Well, good morning. Good morning and welcome to the Carl F.H. Henry Lecture. It's very fitting, I think, that this lecture is being given, as you will see, by Joel Carpenter. Interestingly, the gift for the Carl F.H. Henry Lecture came to Baylor from an organization called IFAX, the Institute for Advanced Christian Studies, which Carl Henry had founded himself. So it's a gift that we have as a legacy of Carl Henry's life and work. I'm Steve Evans. I think most of you probably know me, but I teach philosophy here. It's my privilege and honor this morning to introduce to you Joel Carpenter, a man I have enormous admiration for and whom I'm privileged to count as a good friend. In some ways, it's hard to introduce Joel. He has excelled in so many areas. It's almost as if he's lived several lives simultaneously and enjoyed several different careers, partially consecutive but partially overlapping. I cannot possibly list all his books, his significant edited publications. He's a native of Michigan, graduate of Calvin University. He received his PhD in history from Johns Hopkins University, began his career teaching history at Trinity International University, which is actually where I got my start as a college teacher as well. Joel then moved on a few years later, as I had done a couple of years before him, to Wheaton College, where he taught history. I taught philosophy, of course. And Joel also helped start at Wheaton and later direct the Institute for the Study of American Evangelicals. Joel was part of a sterling group of Christian historians, including George Marsden, Mark Knoll, and Nathan Hatch, who revitalized the study of American religious history. Joel's own major contribution was his Oxford University Press book in 1997, Revive Us Again, The Reawakening of American Fundamentalism, which took up and ably extended the work of George Marsden on the history of conservative Protestantism. In 1989, Joel became the director of the religion program at the Pew Charitable Trust. Here he made a huge impact by providing grants that established a number of important programs, including the African Theological Initiative, the Currents in World Christianity program at Cambridge, the Pew Evangelical Scholars program that I benefited from, and the Pew Younger Scholars program. In 2006, Joel moved back to his alma mater to become provost of Calvin University for the next 10 years. For 3 of those years, I worked as a dean under Joel. I've been in higher education for nearly 50 years, and I can safely say I've never known anyone who was a better administrator than Joel Carpenter. He provided a vision for where Calvin should go, while at the same time keeping systems functioning as they should. He showed me it's possible to be compassionate and empathetic as an administrator while still making tough decisions when necessary. Since stepping down as provost at Calvin, Joel once again reinvented himself, developing his interest in global Christianity into real expertise, as he began and directed the Nagel Institute for the Study of World Christianity. The vision for this institute is both to partner with world Christian scholars and study centers from all over the world, but also to help North American and European Christians reorient their thinking so as to see the importance of Christian faith as it thrives in other parts of the world. During his time as director of the Nagel Institute, Joel raised more than $12 million to fund a significant number of important projects with special connections to China, India, and places in Africa. It's very fitting to have Joel Carpenter deliver the Carl F.H. Henry Lecture, since his topic on the awakening of Christian scholarship was close to Carl Henry's heart. I cannot imagine anyone who could be better at giving us a review of what has happened in Christian scholarship over the last 50 years, as well as a vision for where perhaps it could go and should go. Well, that was a very
gracious and fulsome introduction, Steve. I wonder if you could send a copy of that to my mother. Indeed, the sort of drive I've had as a Christian scholar, of course by God's grace, but part of his grace to me was my mother, whose favorite Bible verse, at least the one she quoted to me the most, was 2 Timothy 2:15. Study to show thyself approved unto God. and approved unto Mom as well. So she's 96, still living in her own home. And in fact, she's as we speak, she's on a cruise up the Snake River, and it was on her bucket list. So, thank you, Steve. As things turned out, this is indeed a Carl Henry lecture. The story I have to tell, in many respects, starts with Carl Henry. So, this is something different than the rest of the conference. It was originally conceived by a conference co-sponsor that had to pull out the Christian Scholars Review. So I'm sorry that they couldn't stay with us, but I begged my way onto the program nonetheless, having written the presentation. So here goes, something different. This is more of a bird's eye view. You've been down in the trenches looking in very granular fashion at matters of accountability. But the story I have to tell here, as a historian, as a storyteller, challenges us with our accountability as well. So here goes. In May of 1970, representatives from 15 northern evangelical liberal arts colleges met at Wheaton College to form a journal, the Christian Scholars Review. It was to be devoted, they agreed, to Christian thought and scholarship and to the theoretical concerns of Christian higher education. CSR's officers invited me to reflect not on their 50-year career. There's actually a very good article on that by Todd Steen in the issue you have. But more broadly, on how Christian scholars' movements have fared since then and how they might address the challenges that they face today. I've been a participant observer in this story for a long time, and I feel accountable for how things have turned out, and I think you should too, if this is your heritage. So please allow me to give an account. Just as CSR has been an interdisciplinary journal, so too this story is very broad in its dimensions. It ranges across the fine arts and language-focused and literary fields, and in mathematics and the natural sciences, and in the social sciences and in professional realms as well. In fact, the story is so large and so busy that I don't know how to tell it all at once. I'll focus on the part I know best then, the story of history and sometimes philosophy, where I know the storyline fairly well and where I think particular developments in those fields prove to be strategic for the larger movement. What I've learned is that there has been a renaissance of Christian intellectual life over the past half century. But one of the most important subsidiary aims of this initiative, which has been to bring depth and maturity to evangelical Christianity, integrity indeed, has not fared so well. In some, we have a renaissance, but not a reformation. After telling the tale of an intellectual renaissance, then I must bring in the opposing tale, culminating in white evangelicals joining the populist uprising that led to the storming of the U.S. Capitol. I argue that evangelical intellectuals are still accountable for their promises to enlighten and ennoble the whole movement, and that there are some fresh sources of wisdom and insight that by God's grace are available for us as we press on with that calling. So, chapter 1, in effect, Saving the West, 1945 to 1975. Renewing Christian culture may have seemed fresh to evangelical scholars in the early 70s when the CSR was founded, but the idea actually arose 3 decades earlier. Alan Jacobs writes in his recent book, The Year of Our Lord, 1943, that even though it was clear that the Allies would win the war, it was not at all clear what sort of civilization the post-war world would be. Jacobs examines the work of Christian intellectuals in Western Europe, such as Jacques Maritain, T.S. Eliot, C.S. Lewis, W.H. Auden, and Simone Weil. and they were seeking a way forward for a morally and spiritually exhausted West. Americans too were joining the chorus, notably New Yorkers Reinhold Niebuhr and Jacques Barzun. American Catholic intellectual leaders who were encouraged by an intellectual and cultural revival in their universities hoped to apply the culture of Catholicism, as they put it, to all of American life. And meanwhile, sounding the call for mainline Protestants, a Methodist Bishop G. Bromley Oxnam said that the post-war world needed a revival with the regenerating power of God's love and forgiveness, righteousness and justice. And there were, less famously, I might add, 3 Reformed Christian philosophers: William Harry Jellema of Indiana University, Cornelius Van Til of Westminster Seminary, and Gordon Clark at Butler University, who were teaching that only the recovery of a Christian world and life view could save and rebuild the West. Now, there was a young professor at Northern Baptist Seminary, Carl F.H. Henry, who followed these 3 philosophers intently. By the mid-1940s, Henry was working summers on a doctoral degree at Boston University and teaching at Gordon College. Henry's ambitious first book, titled Remaking the Modern Mind, which came out in 1946, joined these post-war Jeremiads. He called for the controlling ideas of the Hebrew Christian world life view to rejuvenate Western culture. Henry gave lectures at Gordon College the summers he was working on his doctorate at BU, and eventually they became his second book, The Uneasy Conscience of Modern Fundamentalism, published in 1947. Henry insisted that fundamentalism was not up to the task of remaking the modern mind or reforming society either. Even so, he held out hope that a new evangelicalism might develop a competent literature in every field of study and enact a new reformation. Henry and several young fundamentalists with doctoral degrees from Harvard joined Harold Ockenga, pastor of the nearby Park Street Church in Boston, to found Fuller Theological Seminary in 1947. Fuller's opening, Ockenga said, was the beginning of a new opportunity to restate the principles of Western culture. So these founders of the new evangelicalism aimed to reform the fundamentalist movement and to produce a renaissance of Christian thought and culture. The movement was begun by theologians, but soon it inspired Christian humanists and scientists and artists and social scientists. And Gordon College, where Henry and some of these other so-called Harvard fundamentalists had been teaching, was the early center of this new vision, and hence the creation of the Gordon Review in 1955, and that became the Christian Scholars Review 15 years later. The aspirations of this evangelical intellectual movement were very high, remaking, Western culture. But the achievements were quite thin. In 1960, Billy Graham and Carl Henry convened a number of benefactors in New York to discuss the formation of an evangelical postgraduate university. They wanted to make an evangelical Johns Hopkins, they said. The talks broke off for a number of reasons, including a concern that they could not recruit enough outstanding evangelical scholars to become its faculty members. They just couldn't find them. As a fallback, Henry organized the Institute for Advanced Christian Studies, Steve mentioned, in 1967 with support from the Lilly Endowment. IFACS never put down roots, but it continued for many years as a convening and research grants agency. The late 1960s and early 1970s brought tremendous ferment among evangelical intellectuals. One of the great discoveries was C.S. Lewis, the Oxford and Cambridge Don, who was a champion for the academic life as a Christian calling. He presented a refreshing Christian alternative to fundamentalist moralism and sectarianism and anti-intellectualism. Clyde Kilby, who was professor of English at Wheaton College, was an early advocate for Lewis, and Lewis's fame spread rapidly through American evangelical circles. The other meteoric flash at that time was Francis Schaefer, an American fundamentalist Presbyterian who, after several years of mission work in France and Switzerland, emerged as a Christian cultural critic and an apologist to European youth, engaging Western thought, art, and culture by means of a Christian world and life view. In 1965, Schaefer gave lectures across America, and young evangelicals received him with great excitement. His first two books, Escape from Reason, published in 1968, and The God Who Is There, published that same year, made their way rapidly through the evangelical reading circles. Eventually, careful scholars in philosophy and theology and history and art and politics found distortions and inaccuracies in Schaefer's approach. But initially, his work fired evangelical students' imagination and bolstered their confidence in the realm of ideas. Evangelical professors, meanwhile, were busy putting together networks. The Conference on Christianity and Literature, founded in 1955, established a journal, Christianity and Literature, in the 1960s. Likewise, the Conference on Faith and History emerged in 1967, and its journal, Fides et Historia, began a year later. The Society of Christian Philosophers was founded rather late by this standard in 1978, but it arose in part from annual meetings hosted by Arthur Holmes, philosopher at Wheaton College, that had been going since the mid-1950s. Today, more than 36 Christian learned societies in North America represent scholars, artists, scientists, and learned professionals. These societies provided fellowship for their members and a forum for Christian thinking as well. 13 evangelical colleges organized the Christian College Consortium in 1971 to collaborate on conferences and faculty development and off-campus student programs. All of these schools and many more created a larger Christian College Coalition, now the Council for Christian Colleges and Universities. Strengthening these home bases for Christian scholars was a very good development, but it did not indicate that these colleges were equipped or motivated to promote scholarship as a high priority. So the movement gained strength, Chapter 2. The research and scholarship emerging from these sources was largely a conversation about how to respond to the critical issues of the day. Books published by the Grand Rapids publishers and by InterVarsity Press were the main media for this discourse. A think tank rose up in 1977, Calvin College's Center for Christian Scholarship, was founded to contribute to, and I quote, the solution of complex problems facing humankind today. Its first research team featured environmental scientist Calvin DeWitt from the University of Wisconsin, and they produced Earthkeeping, Christian Stewardship of Natural Resources. Another landmark project there resulted in After Eden, Facing the Challenge of Gender Reconciliation, by a team led by psychologist Mary Stuart Van Leeuwen. A different kind of development arose in American religious history. My field, I was a doctoral student at Johns Hopkins with Timothy Smith, who was focusing on the role of evangelicals in shaping the American nation. Smith had received funding from Robert Lynn of the Lilly Endowment to run a program in American religious history. And it supported grad students and regularly convened some top scholars in the field. And Smith pushed us to uncover new features of the American evangelical story. Unlike the Calvin Center, Smith's program is aimed directly at the academy. Books by evangelical scholars aimed at scholarly audiences, however, were still quite rare in those days. Two early examples were Alvin Plantinga's God and Other Minds, published by Cornell University Press in 1967, and Nicholas Walterstorff's On Universals, an essay in ontology, published by University of Chicago in 1970. These are pioneering works. A pioneering work in my own field is Nathan Hatch's The Sacred Cause of Liberty, Republican Thought and the Millennium in Revolutionary New England. It was published by Yale in 1977. Hatch was a Wheaton alumnus, and he represented a rising trend, graduates of evangelical colleges pursuing a call in academe. As evangelical colleges continued to grow and to gain institutional strength in the 1980s, they were staffed by these young professors. But could one do front-line inquiry with a heavy teaching load and little support for scholarship? Obviously, they could not publish as fast as their peers at research universities, but could they hope that their work might be enriched by their liberal arts learning? George Marsden, for example, published his revised dissertation on the New School Presbyterians shortly after landing at Calvin, but it took a full decade for him to come out with his next book, Fundamentalism in American Culture. But Marsden's first book is, created rather quickly, doctoral dissertation. It's been largely forgotten, but his second one, written over a decade at a liberal arts college, is one of the most influential works in American religious history. So perhaps that liberal arts kind of setting could turn out rich scholarship after all. Marsden was an inspiration to many of us in that field, including Mark Knoll at Trinity, Grant Wacker at North Carolina, Nathan Hatch at Notre Dame, Harry Stout at Connecticut, and Margaret Bendroth, who was studying with Smith at Hopkins. And Knoll started inviting such folk to little weekend conferences at Trinity College. He actually went hat in hand to the student senate and asked them for a few $100 to do that. Knoll subsequently moved to Wheaton in 1978, and then with Hatch, he developed a conference on the role of the Bible in America. And it was funded once again by Robert Lynn in the Lilly Endowment. Lynn asked Knoll and Hatch, the conference is a great success, and Oxford book came out of it. He said, could you found an institute at Wheaton to sustain that sort of work in American religious history? And they did. Lynn made a project grant, and the Institute for the Study of American Evangelicals was begun in 1982. And they loved the idea, but they wanted somebody to run it for them, so I came over the next year to do that. And over his 32-year career, the ISAE became an influential convening center for evangelical scholars and for the study of American religion more generally. During the 1980s, several talented scholars at evangelical colleges departed for major universities where they could do more research and mentor younger scholars. One of the first that I knew of was James Davison Hutter, a sociologist at Westmont College who left for the University of Virginia in 1983. Calvin lost Alvin Plantinga to Notre Dame in 82, George Marsden to Duke in 86, and Nicholas Wollersdorf to Yale in 1989. It felt like a raid. And this trend has continued. The evangelical graduate school students have benefited thereby. They can more readily find encouraging mentors at elite universities. Meanwhile, the ISAE's success pointed the way how to foster research and scholarship at a small liberal arts college. In 1982, Calvin founded a second institution, the Meter Center, to serve the field of Reformation studies, and Wheaton College's Marion Wade Center, which had been organized in 1974, really hit its stride programmatically in the 80s. So this idea of centers and institutes caught on fast, and many have been formed over the past 35 years. Currently, Calvin has 12 of them, Wheaton has 11, and many colleges have one or more. Evangelical Protestants' quest was not the only Christian intellectual movement around. Catholic scholarship in these years was flourishing, and even though it no longer had one sort of unifying philosophy or outlook, such as Neo-Thomism had done earlier in the 20th century for them, Catholic scholars still were doing exemplary work and were rather well supported by their universities. The University of Notre Dame became a leading Catholic intellectual center, and most notably with excellent programs in history and philosophy, but not limited to those. But one early point of contact with evangelicals was the Kushwa Center for the Study of American Catholicism, founded and directed by Jay Dolan, who began holding gatherings in the early 1980s for scholars in American religious history. A similar trend developed among philosophers, After Alvin Plantinga was named to a chair in philosophy at Notre Dame in 1982, a steady stream of evangelical graduate students headed there. The same would happen in history when George Marsden arrived at Notre Dame a decade later. So by the early 1990s, the situation showed much improvement from 20 years earlier. In addition to the Evangelical College's own improvement and the dozens of Christian scholarly guilds, there were now convening centers arising to sustain the networks, and a few scholars had earned notice in the larger academy. Scholars of the boomer generation teaching at evangelical colleges were mentoring undergrads who also hoped to become scholars. So chapter 3, still structural challenges. How would they be met? Nathan Hatch, then a dean at Notre Dame, saw both the movement's promise and its structural impediments. After teaching that, and then he learned that the staff at the Pew Charitable Trust were feeling pressure from their trustees to support evangelical Christianity. He said, here's an opportunity. The Hatch drew up a plan for the Evangelical Scholars Program, which offered project funding to scholars in the humanities, social sciences, and theology to pursue topics of high interest and relevance and to publish the results in the best scholarly media. I see David Jeffrey here. He was on that advisory and selection committee. And meanwhile, I'd been recruited to direct Pew's religion program, so I ran Hatch's proposal past my secular-minded peers at Pew, and I argued that an evangelical intelligentsia, we should support it, and it would help advance a constructive agenda, and just maybe that might be an answer to the rise of the religious right. They bought the idea, so off we went. Between 1990 and 1999, the Pew Scholars Program spent $4 million on 100 grants to evangelical scholars. And evaluation project later found that 75% of the awardees met their basic goal of producing high-end university press publications. Perhaps the most successful in terms of creating a national stir was a book by Charles Marsh, God's Long Summer, Stories of Faith and Civil Rights. It's published by Princeton in '97. And it was featured in the Washington Post, on NPR, and by other influential media. Several of these books catapulted their authors into more influential roles, including Margaret Bendroth's really path-breaking book, Fundamentalism and Gender. And another amazing breakthrough book is Dale Van Clay's book, The Religious Origins of the French Revolution. These books both published by Yale in the late 90s. So Bendroth went on to become the president of the American Society of Church History, and Van Clay left Calvin to mentor doctoral students at Ohio State University. Steve Evans received one of these awards. It was contingent on his promise that he would publish with a high-end university press instead of yet another book with InterVarsity or a Grand Rapids publisher. And the result was Steve's The Historical Christ and the Jesus of Faith, published with Oxford University Press in 1996, and for Steve, no turning back. Went on to even more. Perhaps even more influential was a program that Hatch's chief operative, Michael Hamilton, designed, the Pew Younger Scholars Program, which ran from 1993 to 2000. It prepared many dozens of undergraduate students to enter doctoral programs. This program never received the summative review that it deserved, but everywhere I go in American academia today, I meet profs and deans who tell me I was a Pew Younger Scholar. Here's one. All right, I see that hand. In addition to these programs, Pew made startup grants for a summer seminars program that was hosted at Calvin, and for a review format intellectual magazine, Books and Culture. Pew and Lilly also funded many project grants for religion research during the 1990s, and then turned to investments in centers and institutes that would sustain excellent work and connect Christian scholars with each other and with the larger academy. We invested in the Center for the Study of Religion at Princeton, headed by sociologist Bob Wuthnow and historian Albert Rabateau. We supported projects at the Center for Law and Religion at Emory University. Was headed by the prolific legal scholar John Whitty, and at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Culture at Virginia, headed by James Hunter. We invested in a program in American religious history at Yale, directed by Harry Stout and John Butler. And we leveraged endowing support from Notre Dame for its Center for Philosophy of Religion to accompany Al Plantinga. By the new century, evangelical scholars were progressing in scholarly achievement, and evangelical colleges and universities were taking the task of supporting Christian scholarship somewhat more seriously. One of the dominant features of this long march in Christian scholarship has been the salience of religion as a topical focus. There have been calls for broadening out topics and approaches in Christian scholarship, saying, is that all you can study is religion? And I agree with these calls and support them heartily. Christian scholarship is open to all whose work is Christian in purpose, practice, or perspective. Even so, the focus on religion has played an important strategic role. American academia in the 50s and 60s, even into the 70s, was dominated by a secular approach and ethos based on naturalistic and positivistic assumptions, such as that religion was largely a spent force in modern society, not worth a lot of attention. So for Christian scholars to work from a religious perspective and to show the importance of religion in society and culture were creative, contrarian moves. They've made quite a difference in some fields. In history, for example, the American Historical Association said that between 1975 and 2015, religious history had grown by 150% as a specialization among American historians. And in the American Philosophical Association, fully 12% of the APA's members were also in the Society of Christian Philosophers. One of the more dramatic institutional developments at the turn of the century was right here, as the emergence of Baylor University as a serious player in the field. Baylor was laying plans to become both a decidedly Christian university and to enter the top echelons of research and to make a long and interesting, shall we say, story short, it's made major strides towards those goals. So Baylor provides an encouraging partial answer to a question posed by George Marsden at an ISAE conference about 35 years before, saying, why is there no major evangelical university? It's not really an evangelical university, but there are a lot of born-again, Bible-believing Christians on their faculty. So it joins Notre Dame as a supportive host and encourager of Christian-animated scholarship. So chapter 4, was this, in Dickens' terms, the best of times? An intriguing study of achievement among evangelical intellectuals appeared in 2007, Faith in the Halls of Power, by Michael Lindsay. He showed that evangelical intellectuals had made an entry into the elite institutions that shape American culture. One telling episode was a White House ceremony, November 9, 2006, where the prolific evangelical historian Mark Noll received the National Humanities Medal from President Bush. Noll, who had begun work at Notre Dame that fall after 25 years at Wheaton, had been named just the year before as one of the 25 most influential evangelical leaders in the Time magazine story. And only a decade earlier, Noll had published The Scandal of the Evangelical Mind, which exposed the intellectual character of the tradition and citing especially what he called the intellectual disaster of fundamentalism. But here was Noll, an evangelical, being honored for his extraordinary intellectual achievements by the nation. This event marked an apogee of evangelical achievements in intellectual and academic and current realms. It seemed, and I know there are many others I could cite, people winning high honors in philosophy, for example. And it seemed the best of times, as Dickens put it, to be a Christian scholar, even of an evangelical sort. Unless they become too triumphal, James Hunter warned Christian academics that for all their rhetoric of changing the world, a settled elite in the United States inhabited and patrolled the great national institutions. They held the levers of world-shaping power, and evangelicals did not. The best that evangelical intellectuals could do is to gain trust in a hearing because of their faithful presence. It was a wise advice, I think, but some high-achieving evangelicals had, in fact, joined the American elite. Over the past 15 years, we've seen evangelical scholars continue to grow in number and accomplishments and to chip away at the secular legacy of 20th century academia. 25 years ago, publication with a highly reputed university press was big news on a campus like Calvin's. Today, it's no longer that newsworthy. The current generation is communicated more broadly, too. So the catalogs of InterVarsity Press and the Grand Rapids publishers are crowded with their titles, and they've produced huge amounts of thoughtful content for online media as well. The current generation also lives in a much changed university environment. American academia is no longer a realm of established non-belief, as Marsden put it 30 years ago, but now is frequently described as post-secular, where there appears to be no reigning paradigm or authority. It is an intellectual Wild West, says Mark Knoll, but despite enduring anti-religious bias, those who do their homework, who mount strong evidence, and communicate well can have a hearing. Even the attempts of the woke, anti-liberal left to control campus discourse probably will not prevail. Over the decades, evangelical scholars have been remarkably nimble-footed in dealing with issues and trends that arrive in academia, and I do not see a major intellectual or ideological threat to their continued presence and vitality. It is a very pluralistic scene. So the best of times, but chapter 5, the worst of times. What is more threatening is the sharp decline of interest in and support for the arts, humanities, and some social sciences in American universities today. The liberal arts ideal, thriving for a century and a half in American higher education, has come upon hard times. Student enrollments in liberal arts fields in four-year colleges have declined sharply. Departmental faculty complements have shrunk, and non-elite colleges that are centered upon the liberal arts have suffered especially. Christian colleges and universities have joined in this suffering, especially in the northern U.S., where there's also a demographic decline. Christian colleges and universities have leaned heavily on the humanities to provide contextual and principial thinking, but university leaders are responding to their constituents' pecuniary values with a scramble to reconfigure their college programs and staff. Calvin University, I might say, arguably one of the finest of these institutions, has seen its enrollment shrink by more than 20% over the past decade. But Calvin's officers announced a $22 million gift to establish a school of business. Meanwhile, its vaunted history and philosophy departments have lost half of their faculty positions. Across the CCCU and among the CSR charter members, reports come in of liberal arts in crisis. So just when Christian scholars have achieved new heights in the arts, humanities, and social sciences, they find that most evangelical students and their parents don't want what they have to share. I don't have any easy answers for this crisis in educational values, but I think that it is a moment of truth for Christian higher education. Our main message, that college is to equip its graduates to lead a God-honoring life as agents of God's reign, seemed to be shouted down by the prevailing message that a college education is for gaining the skills to become economically secure. It is a commodity, an investment, an experience to be bought and sold. Christian colleges and universities have made their way in the past by being at least a bit countercultural, and today they need to convince themselves and their constituents that the prevailing view of what an education is for is profoundly mistaken. If higher ed is to be deeply Christian, then the liberal arts project, which has the tools to address the great gospel and culture questions, must take the lead. Surely there are people of means among our university's alumni who could subsidize the liberal arts project to help it weather rough cultural seas. Surely there are ways to persuade students to study what it means to be human and to live with integrity. We can and we must if we are to save the soul of Christian higher education. Pecuniary and instrumental values are but one of the problems with the thinking, belief, and practice of evangelical Christians today. If Carl Henry were alive, he might wonder whether the new evangelicalism had, in the end, lost out to the fundamentalists. More than ever, Mark Noll concludes, he has a new revised edition of the Scandal book coming out. He concludes, the evangelical mind appears to be an oxymoron. Indeed, the past 5 years appear to be the worst of times. When Dickens penned this phrase, he was referring, of course, to the howling, murderous mobs of the French Revolution. And here in the United States, we beheld a similar spectacle at the U.S. Capitol this past January. Watching that god-awful display repeat with Jesus and Trump banners was one of the worst moments of my life. I had to ask, what good did it do for Mark Noll to receive a medal from a U.S. president for his virtuous achievements when evangelical voters overwhelmingly supported an amoral and dangerous presidential candidate who was profoundly lacking of the virtues needed to serve in high office? What did it mean for Noll to have been named one of the nation's most influential evangelicals? His influence did not reach very far, it seems. Noll had warned repeatedly in his publications and his talks about the fallacies and failures of Christian nationalism. But many evangelicals were embracing simplistic and strident calls to make America great again. Noll wrote that race and racism have haunted America and its politics from the beginning. But white evangelicals are among the least likely to admit that racial injustice is still pervasive in America. Noll reminded us that evangelical leaders 150 years ago revered the work of scientists, and he encouraged contemporary evangelicals to put away the science skepticism that they had inherited from the fundamentalist movement. But evangelicals today are among the most likely to deny human-induced climate change and to doubt scientific knowledge about pandemics and vaccines. Noll warned about the destructive effects of conspiratorial thinking, but white evangelicals today are among the most likely to believe the vicious theories of QAnon and other lies, such as a stolen presidential election. So we see extraordinary intellectual achievements among evangelical and determinedly Christian scholars. We see the many evangelical institutions of higher learning, 140 of them in the U.S. now affiliating with the CCCU. Yet at the same time, we see evangelicals increasingly going for populist preachers and parachurch leaders who are dismissive of such efforts and who express views that are starkly contrary to the gospel. Says Mark Noll, and I quote, "No half-baked conspiracy, however lacking in responsible verification, seems too much. Are the Christian colleges and universities failing, or are they just spitting into the whirlwind?" Jesus said that false prophets would arise and that they would try to deceive the very elect. And so they have. Charisma magazine was full of such false revelations. Some of the prophets are chagrined that they falsely predicted President Trump's reelection. But the truly false prophecy was endorsing him in the first place. We're seeing signs of civilization decline in America. And in times like these, real prophets speak hard truths. They do not endorse rulers who personify the nation's idolatry of money, sex, and power. John Calvin summarized the findings of true prophets when he said, "Those who rule unjustly and incompetently have been raised up by God to punish the wickedness of the people." Not many evangelical leaders are prophesying like that. So what are evangelical scholars to do about this state of affairs? One thing to do is to realize that while the situation seems extreme today, it is not totally new. Recall that when Carl Henry and Harold Ockenga began their efforts to reform fundamentalism, they had to contend with the likes of Carl McIntyre, John R. Rice, and Bob Jones. These threats have changed in the particulars, but not so much in nature. In 1985, for example, when the ISAE hosted the first of its conferences on evangelicals and the life of the mind at the Billy Graham Center, the moral majority was at high tide and the fundamentalist takeover was beginning in the Southern Baptist Convention. And behind the scenes at the Graham Center, where the ISAE worked, there were anxious advisors who were telling Billy Graham that the ISAE's critical scholarship might sow confusion among the faithful, and that he ought to have the institute removed from the Graham Center. Billy Graham, to bless his heart, replied that Christian academics needed the freedom to address varying viewpoints and to ask uncomfortable questions. So, Billy Graham of blessed memory. A quarter century later, as Michael Hamilton reflected on the impact of the Pew Scholars programs, he counseled there would always be anti-intellectual forces within evangelicalism and anti-Christian forces in the evangelical world. The need to identify, support, and network talented and committed evangelical scholars to combat these forces will ever be with us. So one part of the answer as to what evangelical and other Christian scholars are to do is to stay the course. No turning back, my friends, no turning back. Through the years, the Christian scholars movement has been fueled by the conviction that it was a band of brothers and sisters with a cause. My main concern for the current generation of Christian scholars, who are more numerous and talented and accomplished than ever, is that it must persist as a movement, if not to save the West, then to save the integrity of Christianity in our time. Our times, however, present some formidable obstacles to engaging the evangelical rank and file. American social and economic structures have changed drastically over the past 50 years. Both Steve Evans and I, Steve says I can tell this story, he and I were both born into blue-collar homes. His father was a bus driver. Mine worked for the phone company. Both of us were able to go to good private colleges, on to grad school, and become professors. Today, such upward social mobility is far, far less likely to happen. The worlds of working families and those who graduate from or teach in private universities are increasingly distant and alienated. This alienation comes from the rise of an elite class in the United States, to which professors, even junior professors, tend to belong. Some have called it the creative class, the meritocracy, the cosmopolitans, or, says David Brooks, the bobos, bohemian bourgeoisie. Our status as professors distances us from most white evangelicals. George Packer and David Brooks especially have argued that not only are there great economic gaps and barriers between the cultured elites and many other folk today, but these cosmopolitans are becoming increasingly isolated and estranged, even toward many affluent Americans who do not share their educational credentials or learned professions or values. Many ordinary Americans deeply resent what they hear from this meritocracy, that they are smarter, more enlightened, and more tolerant than other people. Trump won in 2016 because he made the white working class and a large swath of middle class, real Americans feel like they were being heard. As David Brooks put it, when you tell a large chunk of the country that their voices are not worth hearing, they're going to react badly. And they have. White evangelicals evidently made up a large part of the pro-Trump coalition, and Kristen Dumez's new and hard-hitting book, Jesus and John Wayne, explains why that happened. For several decades now, she says, evangelicals who embraced Trump have believed that they and the cosmopolitan elites were engaged in a war for the soul of the nation, and they took to forceful, even violent heroes to rescue them. Evangelicals have been embracing authoritarian religious leaders, too, and people in the pews have repeatedly excused these celebrities' moral lapses. One of the most sickening chapters of Kristen's book is called Evangelical Mulligans, and it tells the story, I think, of 2 or 3 dozen eminent evangelical pastors or parachurch leaders who committed sins against their own people, abusive, and were let off lightly. Evangelical men's and women's and family ministries have embraced gender ideals of forceful men and submissive women and glorified violent action as a mark of true manhood. Trump then was not all that difficult to accept. He could play the warrior hero that evangelicals had come to revere. Dumez's book was a revelation to me. I'd heard of these developments, but I'd not encountered them in my churches that I was a member of. I think that like many evangelical intellectuals, I had found congregations that sheltered me from these values and trends. In joining ranks with a meritocracy, have we not only insulated ourselves from evangelical excesses, but also accepted much of the cosmopolitan elite's definition of the good life? Our own life trajectories, the new class structures of America, have put us into less and less contact with the ordinary Americans, including many white evangelicals. They feel left out, threatened, disrespected by the meritocracy, and they are fighting back. This trend is not just a seasonal or incidental matter. It has major social forces and economic structures undergirding it. So now what? What can we do about that? For many of us, the main encounter we have with the residents of real America is on campus and in the classroom. And what do we expect our colleges and universities to be doing about this culture war? Is it our job to turn real Americans into bobos or cosmopolitans? That's not likely. Furthermore, thoughtful Christians should be able to see that there are aspects of the cosmopolitan class's beliefs and values and ways of living that are not in tune with the gospel. And there are beliefs and values and life ways among rural working class and non-elite suburban middle class people that do honor God's ways and will. Since none of these social sectors then have a lock on what it means to live according to God's word and God's ways, my hope is that we Christian scholars might try to do and be something else. What comes to mind is John Stott's call back in the 70s to be a counterculture, to engage in radical discipleship. What can we do to champion a campus life that more faithfully gives witness to that mode of Christian human flourishing the biblical writers call shalom? On the research and scholarship and teaching front, we can do what Nick Woldersdorf calls praxis-oriented scholarship, which features analysis of the structures and dynamics of our social world, a critical appraisal and strategies preserving what ought to be preserved and changing what ought to be changed. So Kevin, can our sociologists say we're going to look more at rural America than we have, for example? Much of current praxis-oriented scholarship has focused on urban conditions. Doing that work is right and good and still needed, but the lines of the current culture war also run between, for example, my neighborhood in Grand Rapids, which has some Black Lives Matter signs in the yards of white people, and my hometown of Allegan, 40 miles away, where the yard signs are all for Trump. Small town America is in deep trouble economically and culturally, and Christian scholars in their colleges could be doing appraisals of what's wrong and developing strategies to right those wrongs. They could feature small business dynamics in business courses and internships. They can engage the community more directly in local arts and civic endeavors. Real Americans and cosmopolitans have lost touch with each other and need to reconnect. Students can learn from local talent how to work and create with their hands. I remember asking my students once at Wheaton, and this was even, this is 35 years ago, how many of you have worked on a farm or a factory? Well, okay, so I see a show of hands here. Not one student there raised their hand. I was the only one in the room who'd worked on a farm and on a factory. So can we teach our children what it means, our students, what it means to create with and work with their hands? Berea College, a Christian institution in rural Kentucky, teaches their students manual skills and requires them to do manual labor. We should do more of that. If we want to make a difference on this front, we'll need to be more than finishing schools for cosmopolitans. The key to making a difference today, I believe, is recognizing two things about our situation. First, the historic evangelical project in the post-war era has fallen on very bad times. and is much in need of renewal and reform. Second, we live as a religious minority in an increasingly diverse nation, and we would do better by impressing others with our wholesome, creative, and constructive thinking and living rather than trying to impose our will on others politically. Historic evangelical movements and those today in other parts of the world have thrived on the margins, where they do not forget to seek integrity and renewal. Let's invest our lives then in intellectual and creative communities that give a witness to that beautiful mode of flourishing the Bible calls shalom. I could stop at this point. Maybe you're ready for me to do that. But I wouldn't be true to my own pilgrimage as a Christian scholar if I did. For the past 2 decades, I've been studying the rise of Christianity elsewhere in the world. Our faith is now a predominantly non-Western religion, and its main centers are in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. And that fact changes everything for Christian scholars. Gospel and culture issues demanding thoughtful responses multiply and priorities shift. So through the Nagel Institute at Calvin, we have raised millions and enlisted hundreds of scholars worldwide to strengthen Christian cultural engagement in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. That's all well and good, no doubt you're thinking, but we have a crisis here. Shouldn't we be focusing on our own situation? The problem with that approach is that we have trouble seeing the cultural waters that we inhabit, or considering ways of being and doing that come from beyond them. Let me cite 2 large examples very quickly. Despite all our critical efforts, it's very hard for Western Christian scholars to think beyond the outlook and assumptions of Christendom, which has officially supported and culturally assimilated Christianity. The same is true for the Enlightenment and its rationalistic values and reductionistic outlook. Majority world Christians, however, do not share these basic legacies. They can look across the cultural grain and help us to see things differently. We need their help, I think. In this final section, let me offer some examples, all drawn from a Christian scholar from West Africa, the Ghanaian theologian Kwame Bediako. Kwame Bediako, who born in 1945, died in 2008, was the founding rector of the Akrofi Christaller Institute in Ghana that focused on Christianity's encounter with African religions. From that analysis, Bediako created fresh approaches to theological fields such as Christology, theology of religions, biblical interpretation, worship, and the gospel and culture dialectic. I see 4 themes in African Christian thought, a la Bediako, that come to bear powerfully on our task at hand. First of those, identity. Identity has been a prime issue for African Christians. The main question, and I hear this in India and in China too, what does it mean to be a Christian and to be an African? Or to be a Christian and to be an Indian? And especially when so many critics say that Christianity is foreign to those places and alienating. Western Christendom can hardly imagine this problem. Does anybody say, what does it mean to be Christian and to be American? As if somehow they're opposed ideas? Well, maybe we should. Western Christendom can't see it, but seeing Africans struggle to come to terms with this question might prompt us to see fault lines between Christianity and our national identity. Any nation that claims to be Christian holds up a far more searing standard to its national life than most Christian nationalists can bear. Where, for example, do some of the values that we uphold in our public life here, such as revenge and honor, come from? Perhaps from the distant forests of our pagan past, but not from the gospel of Jesus Christ. We tend to think of syncretism as an African problem, but we too retain pagan values here. They're hidden behind a Christendom veneer, so Africans who clearly see the idols they contend with might help us identify ours. Second, religion. Religious experience and practice are central to being human. But the intellectuals of the post-Enlightenment West have deemed religion a spent force and not terribly relevant. Bediako taught that religious consciousness is primal to humanity, and that its deep currents will rise to the surface, even in post-Christian West. In Africa and Asia in particular, Christians also live in religiously plural societies, and they learn via daily encounters to take life's religious and spiritual dimensions seriously and to appreciate these dimensions of other faiths. In Western Christendom, Christianity's religious monopoly has given it scant preparation for this task, yet religious diversity grows year by year here. We need to attend to the multiple religious perspectives and practices and to see religious experience and obligations as prime reference points for Christian thinking. African Christians' long experience with thinking religiously can guide us. Political power. One of Bediako's frequent themes, especially in the face of authoritarian rule in post-colonial Africa, was the way in which traditional societies in Africa sacralized power and bestowed it on rulers because of their priestly status as mediators to the gods and ancestors. Christian thinking, however, he said, desacralizes power. Any power that rulers have is delegated to them by God and is contingent on rulers continuing to honor God's will and God's ways. Yet in our day, both in the West and in the majority world, we see the rise of rulers who attempt to mythologize their rule and create an aura of godlike grandeur around their person. Bediako deflates these attempts by returning to the outrageous political claim of the Apostle Paul that Jesus Christ is Lord and Savior of the world. That was a common appellation for Caesar, don't you know? That's why Christians were persecuted, because they said, no, Jesus is Lord. So Christians in politics, Bediako teaches, are to embody the power of the Lord Jesus and of the cross, which produces self-sacrificing love, non-dominating and humble leadership and accountability, not only to the people that one serves, but to the Lord and Savior of the world. Ubuntu, community. Thanks to Desmond Tutu, we've heard this Zulu word, which means I am because we are. Africans are communal people who think and live much more in we terms than in I terms. African Christianity is deeply communal, as was the faith in the New Testament times. Professor Andrew Walls of Scotland, he was Bediako's mentor. He was quite smitten with these values that he saw in African circles, and his vision for Christian renewal of Western thought and academia was that we should form ashrams, modeled after Indian communities of intense spiritual, artistic, and intellectual cultivation. Walls thought that the Bediako's Acrophete Christaller Institute was a prime example of the intellectual creativity and spiritual integrity that these focused communities should produce. Our professions, however, they honor individual achievement much more than communal impulses. But I have found great joy, wisdom, and power in communal scholarly dynamics. What I've treasured most in my 50 years within Christian intellectual circles has been the fellowship. I'll never forget what Kwame Bediako said in his final public address. In our own generation, the practice of Christian scholarship is the nurture of a living community of scholars, and much less the nurture of one's individual career. Even so, we cannot let Ubuntu values lead us into our own brand of tribalism with closed intellectual enclaves and an implicit acceptance of the alienation driven by the new class structures of America. That's one of the problems I have with the inclination of many of us to scrap the evangelical label and repackage our identity. It might in fact be an attempt to distance ourselves from some rude and unruly kinfolk for whom we should remain accountable. I'd rather that we dig deeper, reemploy original impulses of evangelicals, of the Wesley's generation. They were striving for the renewal of spiritual integrity within older Christian traditions and seeking the welfare of the society in which they were planted. Evangelical participation in populist movements to seize power has done horrific damage to the movement's public reputation and inner integrity. It is time for evangelical intellectuals to step away from power grabs and build anew, as my Catholic friend Todd Harch puts it, seeking by God's grace the true, good, and beautiful in our communities and in our engagement with others. We need to bloom where we've been planted and keep open the doors of fellowship and mutual reproof and correction so that we are ever ready to speak and hear the truth in love. I agree with David Brooks that instead of bobos, we need to be bridge builders. So, in conclusion, the new evangelical theologians who founded Fuller Seminary and the hopeful Christian scholars of Gordon College and beyond, who founded the Christian Scholars Review, would stand amazed at the scope and quality of the movement they started. There has indeed been a rebirth of evangelical scholarship, artistry, and higher education in partnership with intellectuals from other Christian traditions. We have not saved Western civilization, and it was presumptuous to think that we might. Instead, we've built a remarkable network of thought, fellowship, and agency for Christian cultural engagement that strives for integrity in its witness to God's reign. Even so, this has been a renaissance of scholarship without a broader reformation of evangelical Christianity. For the fundamentalist impulse is at least as strong as it was in Carl Henry's day, and is probably even more dangerous now than it was then. Contemporary American values and social structures pose formidable challenges, as does the state of higher education. Yet by God's grace, we've been given remarkable resources and opportunities to address these challenges, not least the wisdom to be gained from majority world Christianity. I've been blessed deeply in my calling to the project of Christian intellectual and cultural engagement, and I trust that you have been too. As my wise colleague Neil Plantinga once put it, according to God's intelligence, the way to thrive is to help others to thrive. The way to flourish is to cause others to flourish. The way to fulfill yourself is to spend yourself. That's been true for me. May it be so for you.
We have a little time for questions, and I'm sure that there are some provocative sayings here that people will want to respond to. Yes.
Thank you so much. This is important work, and I appreciate particularly the historian's perspective on it. I've been in education all my life. I look around me and I feel like you failed. But I wonder, again, taking the historical perspective, that part of the problem, maybe, is that Christian scholars adopted a lot of the values of the academy, in which speaking to small audiences of people that think largely like you do, in very specialized terms, is what was most highly valued. And the attention to educating for a more literate populace, if you will, biblically literate, would have been the better way to go. I think about the analogy of the business school. And again, as a historian, you want to see the liberal arts thrive. But, business people are going to be out in the business world, and they're going to be very influential, and we want them to have the kind of education that, as Christian University, we would be proud for them to go out into the business world and, as we say at Baylor, filling your green and gold bra. So, just some thoughts. I struggle with this a lot, and again, I just wonder if that's maybe where our focus should be. We tend to put our most prestigious scholars into graduate courses, for example, and maybe that's not where they belong. Just thoughts.
Absolutely. No, Madam Provost, I think you're really hitting on something very important. And on the one hand, how does knowledge advance? But people, getting down into the trenches and doing the fine-grained intellectual work. But on the other hand, we are educators too, and we have a lot of educative venues that we can be working in. And I look at this and I thought, why haven't I done more books for wider readership? Why haven't I taught more adult Sunday school classes? I guess people have specialties. People have predilections and talents. But I think for Christian scholars, especially if in fact you say this agenda of reform and integrity in our own movement matters, then what are we doing for that? That's huge.
And I might just add, we now have churches that are led by ministers with literally no biblical training.
Absolutely.
And that seems to be up.
Yeah. Yeah. Right.
Thank you, Jill.
Yeah.
Andrea Turpin, I'm one of George Marsden students, as you may remember, and the graduate program director of history here at Baylor.
Wonderful.
Wanted to build on Provost Burkhouse's comment a little bit, maybe the flip side of it. She was asking about how do we take you seriously and connect our scholarship as Christian scholars more with the people in the pews. That's the disconnect we've been hitting on. I thought you had some really wise thoughts about class. I have a two-part question. It's more about how to get representatives from the wide Christian world in academia, because to a certain extent we all ask questions about our own lives, and we ask the kinds of questions that come from our own backgrounds and experiences.
Yeah.
And so when I was listening to your talk, I noticed, and I'm the beneficiary of your generation, of you, and the networks you've built. You mentioned only 2 women and 2 people of color, right? Peggy Bendroth, Kristen Dumais. Kristen Dumais is my generation. Albert Bravato and Kwame Bediako, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. I just learned that from you. And so part one is, why do you think that was? Why was that part of the church underrepresented in the first generation of American evangelical scholars that you're describing? But part two is, what wasn't underrepresented? And I think that you made an excellent point, is class, right? You talked about you and Steve came from working class backgrounds. And that's becoming less represented now as the other is becoming somewhat more represented. And how can we also currently continue to reach out to people from working class backgrounds to bring their experience into academia?
Yes, absolutely. I made no apologies for this at the beginning, but you're right that this was overwhelmingly a white male movement, I think through our formal programs we affirmatively acted on for candidates of color and who were female, and made that much progress. In some respects, I mean, we reflected the structural problems of our society and of academia more generally through all those years. And I would insist that people keep looking for structural ways to make that happen. I think one of the things that Christian colleges and universities need to keep doing is not to find ways to be artificially selective, right? To always think about we couldn't increase our enrollments here. We've become richer and better endowed. Does that mean we're opening the doors for more people, right? Are we establishing the networks and the contacts that would produce natural pipelines of students from communities that are economically disadvantaged or have a history of racial oppression? We need to do it. We need to keep doing it. We need to persist. When I was provost at Calvin, we started out, I think it was a paltry 3% people of color at Calvin. Today it's 19% plus 12% internationals who are mostly from the majority world. So it can be done, but you have to persist. You don't think that one flashy program 1 year is going to do it. It's a 30-year haul, right? So that's important. But I think the class issue is absolutely huge, and it is a structural problem in this country. And one of the best ways that profs can help to enrich and ennoble the Christian movements that feed students into their classrooms is to make sure that their students see that as their mission as they come out. So we need to keep saying we're educating for God's reign, and that not only means principled excellence in your profession, but it means giving of yourself in your community. So that's, we have to double down on that message and that sort of culture inside of our places. And the structures and the trends of academia are against that. So we need to be countercultural, and we need people to support us in that.
Joel, thanks for your talk. I was very intrigued, especially by the first part, about what a great job Calvin did of incentivizing Christian scholarship. Starting the Center for Christian Scholarship in the 70s, I'm even a beneficiary of that. And I think that's one thing you struggle with here at Baylor, and I see at other Christian colleges and universities, is how do you incentivize faculty to engage in this project? And what would you say, in your mind, are the best things that other institutions can do, or what could perhaps be exported to other institutions that perhaps even here at Baylor we can do, or other Christian institutions?
Well, I think one of the things I'm seeing many Christian colleges and universities doing now, well, first off, it's, as the provost was saying last night, it's a matter of hiring in. What's your story as a believer, and do you know what our story is, and do you want to be part of that? So that's at the very start. But then going forward, many institutions are doing first-year seminars for their faculty. They say part of your teaching load, part of your paycheck this year is really digging in and understanding what it means to follow this vocation as a Christian. So I think those are not new tricks, but I think they're effective ones.
Todd Hunters here from the Philosophy Department of Baylor University. I'm one of the Pew Younger beneficiaries of the Pew Younger program that you described.
Wonderful.
So you can keep the record going of always meeting someone in circles. I'm going to ask a question that's a little bit in the same vein, but I'd like to maybe sharpen it a bit maybe draw attention to what seems to be part of the hardest part of the question in processing the advice of staying the course while also bridging the class issue. And part of what I worry about in staying the course is just the sheer cost of trying to build and work in, as I do here at Baylor, a research one university. It's an expensive proposition. So the question that has occupied some Christian scholars for so long is why no major Christian research university? But to build one of those is an extremely expensive proposition. And we have, in my years at Baylor, I think seen an astonishing rise in the cost. And I think that feeds into the expectations of students of what they're going to get out of an education with regard to the pecuniary interest in the class polishing school issues that you raised. So part of my question is, in staying the course, are we building the right institutions? Are there other kinds of cheaper things? I think what we do in philosophy, all I need is a shade tree and a library card. It's very cheap. We can do that at an entirely different price point. So I want to ask about the staying the course question there with regard to whether research universities and that kind of scholarly enterprise is really the right thing.
I think there are things about, so you say the main thing about research university that's daunting is the cost end of it, right? Well, I would not be one to say let's ditch the dream of having Christian or Christian-friendly research universities. I benefited so much from the mentoring of a devoted Christian dissertation supervisor at Johns Hopkins. At that point, a resolutely secular place. It's less secular now. There are a half dozen different gospel choirs at Johns Hopkins. That would have been unheard of when I was there. But I think Christian people are called to that sort of work, and you can do that, of course, at a prestigious public or private university. But I think that the opportunity for Christians to do that work in community and to see some distinctive contributions to the way scholarship in this or that field runs is hugely important. The one thing about cost structures is you have to ask, well, what are we buying into? What are we paying for? Let me say something heretical here in Texas, but D1 sports is a huge cost issue, and the provost may say, well, it brings in money too, but how much of that is recirculated into better facilities for sports? There are other models out there. Johns Hopkins, University of Chicago, those are not D1 schools, and they are, world class. So that's one issue. The other is I'm not really convinced that tuition cost structures are going out of sight. I think what's happened more is you look at the basic structures of family finance these days, and how's that taking place? Because I did just a little study based on Calvin University, what its asking price for tuition is, never mind the discount rate. What its asking price for tuition is, what it was 50 years ago when I enrolled, and how has that changed? And it's grown tenfold. But then I look at what was the sticker price for a brand new car in 1970, and what is it today? And it's almost exactly the same sort of structural change, right? So now, I think maybe one of the bigger structural issues has to be what has happened to wages and salaries over that same period, right? And what has happened to family indebtedness and spending patterns over that same period. So, I'm a bit of I have some skeptical questions to ask about people who say the price is just getting to be out of sight. But no, I hear you, and I still say to parents who are thinking, look, send my kid to Calvin or send my kid to Johns Hopkins as an undergrad. I said Calvin undergrad, then Hopkins. I still think that institutions that are determined to invest time and effort and structures into undergraduate education is absolutely huge and potentially much more formative for the religious traditions that sponsor these schools than the postgraduate work. I wouldn't say don't do it. America, higher ed is a large and diverse system. There's room for lots of things. But I really still hold out for intently focused mentorship of young people in the undergraduate programs.
Probably have time for another question or two if they're brief. Yeah.
Joel, I wanted to add a coda to what you said and then ask a question. When I was a business faculty member at Calvin, there were no scholarly forums in which to share ideas about what it meant to be distinctively Christian in business goals and practices. There were no places for business faculty who were Christians to gather. So we felt the need to start one. And as we started one, the first question was, who else has done this? And we went and talked to the people at the Conference on Faith and History and said, how did you do this? And I went and talked to the people in the Society of Christian Philosophers and said, how did you do this over a decade ago? And we learned from them about how to do it. We developed the Christian Business Faculty Association. So here's my question. what's happening in universities now, where there's this much more applied emphasis in business schools, engineering, computer science, healthcare professions, social work. How would you think about the capacity of people who have the longer and deeper maturity in the arts and the humanities helping people to form distinctly understandings of these more applied fields of study? How could our scholarly networks help each other in that interdisciplinary effort?
I think there's tremendous potential in that regard, and I've seen it. Two things I think need to happen. One is that some of these disciplines need to survive on campuses, so they have some kind of critical mass of faculty that the more applied fields can go to and learn. And secondly, there needs to be the kind of campus culture where that is not only permitted but expected. You know, and I've seen so that you don't say, well, my discipline or my profession is self-sufficient and hermetically sealed, and there's nothing for us to learn from anybody else. But to say, you know, you will learn from others, and we all need to learn from others. So I saw a marvelous thing happen my years as provost at Calvin. We had, you know, a really fine, first-rate, strong nursing faculty, and they were intellectually hungry, and they caught the vision of, you know, a Christian world and life view, and every profession under Christ's lordship, and needs to engage and enact Christianly. And they went to a friend in philosophy who was a specialist in the ethics of care, and they said, "Help us, you know, we want to develop a Christian foundation for nursing profession." And they did seminar for a couple of years, and they together wrote a book. So, you know, I know it can happen. I've seen it happen, but first off, there's got to be a sense of permission for it to happen. There's got to be a campus culture that expects it to happen, and some of these core disciplines need to survive and be honored and supported. Yeah.
Well, I think we have come to 10 o'clock, which is our appointed time, so
Yeah.
let's thank Joel again.